everybody. Come on, sit down. Shush. This is not very loud and they're still talking. I'm looking at you, man in the pale blue shirt. It's like being at school. Come on, everybody. I also feel very squashed here, but anyway, never mind, it'll all be brilliant. Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Baroness Veer. I am the relatively new Minister for Maritime. I have been in the Department for Transport since 2019, and I used to cover aviation, and now I'm back doing aviation, and then for 3 years in the middle, I did roads and buses and local transport, all that sort of stuff. So I know quite a lot about transport. I don't know a huge amount about maritime yet, but I have been amazed by what I found out so far. And in terms of the decarbonisation journey, I think we've got a little way to go. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here at COP27 to start talking to you about what the UK will be doing over the coming year ahead and also subsequently. Because if we think back to a year ago when we were at COP26, we signed the Clydebank Declaration, and that I think was really, really important because for the first time we managed to get together 24 signatories who actually made some proper commitments, which I think we will be able to stick with. If we can get 6 shipping corridors by the middle of the decade, which surely we should be able to do, then we are well on our way, but of course then we need 200 plus by 2030. So there is still an awful lot still to do. Because we all know that maritime is pretty polluting. And my notes here tell me that it's the equivalent to the world's 8th largest state. I mean, that's a bit depressing. But what I am heartened by, if I look to what I think about maritime versus sort of aviation, and if you look at the success that we had at ICAO, I think that there is direct read across as to what we can do in maritime, bringing together like-minded nations to help get something over the line in the future. So it's absolutely critical that we continue moving down that trajectory, going from the Clydebank Declaration and moving that forward. And if you look at who is involved, it's absolutely brilliant that we've got so many countries involved. Singapore and Australia have announced their commitment to collaborate on green shipping corridors as part of the Green Economy Framework, and we have the Republic of Korea and the US, as have the Republic of Korea and the US. So that's absolutely brilliant. And it's a pleasure to have Mr. Yap from Singapore here today. So also, other things that I think are really, really helpful is the launch yesterday, I think it was, of the Zero-Emission Shipping Missions Green Corridors Hub. Absolutely critical that we share learning and we share information because otherwise we will not be able to do this. No single port, no single nation state is going to be able to do this on its own because, let's face it, the ships go somewhere, and when they go somewhere they need to get the fuel to come back again. So it's essential that we have both ends of the route sorted out. So the UK will continue to lead and to take a really enlightened and forward-thinking view as to how we decarbonise maritime. We're absolutely looking to work with like-minded nation states. We want our ports to be working with other ports around the world to share their knowledge, because none of us is able to do this on its own. So I would now like to hand over to Casper, who is going to tell us about the first annual progress report on green shipping corridors. I'm hoping he's going to have good things to say, but I also hope he's going to tell us what we need to do next. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Minister, and thank you for convening this and taking that leadership role. I think what you talked about in terms of leadership, collaboration, and action are exactly what's needed to move from where we are today to where we need to be by 2030, and also eventually to fully decarbonize international shipping by 2050. I think looking at what happened at COP26 and the Clydebank Declaration, I think it really set a lot of actions in motion and really brought together people around the concept of green corridors. What I'm going to be presenting today is the first report. We think it's the first of many, where we track the progress to see what's happening, what are the challenges remaining, and how can the public and the private sector work together to overcome these challenges. The report is now launched. There's a lot more depth and detail than I can actually share today. Otherwise, I would probably also bore you. But I can just encourage you to explore this in more detail, and we're always ready to take any questions and input and suggestions that you can come. So, as to the background, as we heard, shipping is a fairly significant emitter of carbon dioxide, GHG emissions, around 2 to 3%. It's not surprising since shipping is also carrying around 80% of global trade, so it's a really, really crucial part of the global economy, and we cannot globalize or decarbonize global economy without decarbonizing shipping, so we need to see it as part of that transition. I think the good news is, building on the work we do with stakeholders from across the value chain, is it is possible. We do have the technologies, we do know what needs to happen, but we don't have a lot of time, and again, green quarters can be one of those things that can help us reach those targets. So, diving into the report, and this is really awkward not being able to see what's behind me, but maybe just the next slide, please. So what is a green corridor? Maybe it's good to start by defining what we're actually talking about. To us, a green corridor is specific routes where the technological, economic, and regulatory feasibility of zero-emission shipping is catalyzed through public and private actions. I think sometimes we like to say that a green corridor is like a special economic zone for green shipping, really taking out and finding those opportunities and working to see what works in kind of a sandbox mode a little bit that can then build and be scaled as we move towards this transition. In the report, we're tracking 3 different types of progress. And just to kind of give away the key points, we're seeing a lot of progress. We're looking at what are the initiatives that are being presented, how much has that developed. We look at what governments are doing in terms of policy and regulation, knowing that policy and regulation and government leadership is a key catalyst for the action we're doing, and also trying to look into how are we doing on the momentum? Are we on track to hit those targets that's been set by the Clydebank Declaration and the overall targets of reaching 5% net zero emission fuels by 2030 on the path to full decarbonization? The report is based on input from most of the Green Corridor projects that have been announced, as well as the majority of the Clydebank signatories. So it's really built on the practitioners, and I know later we'll hear from some of those exactly what's happening and what they need. So, next slide, please. So just to give you the global overview, in just about 1 year's time, we have seen more than 20 Green Corridor projects announced. In the report, we have 21, but they're almost coming every week, so I'll just stick to saying more than 20. It involves some of the biggest trade lanes in the world, so Rotterdam, Singapore, LA to Shanghai, Australia to East Asia, iron ore route, and of course also many smaller routes. We see more than 100 stakeholders across the whole value chain actively working on to make green corridors a reality. And I think this gives a promise that we can not only meet the targets set out, we can actually exceed them if we manage to keep up the pace. So far, I think that looks good. In terms of the operating profiles, we see a majority of the work being focused on short sea shipping, shorter routes, which of course are some of the easier ones if it's only a bilateral route, shorter distances. But we also, and I think this is very encouraging, seeing deep sea routes being developed, because of course those are where the massive amounts of fuels are being burned. So it's really encouraging to see both. And we can also see some that have said, we want to build a green corridor, but we need to do a bit more analysis before we determine exactly what is the best opportunity. We're also seeing a lot of leadership and collaboration. We've also looked at who are leading these initiatives. And I think to us, and I think this is very encouraging, we see a lot of public-private initiatives. Governments funding work, governments leading work, but we also, of course, see ports being kind of those nodes really playing a leading role. So I think that's very, very encouraging. I think we can also say, and maybe not a surprise since we're only 1 year away from COP26, that most of the projects are still in the early phases, defining the project, finding out what we need to do. But we do see some that have progressed and done real feasibility studies and are now moving into the implementation phase. And I think what we really need to see is that movement accelerating, because as we all know, we don't have a lot of time. I think what's also interesting in seeing when those that have defined their plans, they're really looking at introducing the first zero-emission vessels towards the end of this decade, 2027, 2030. And I don't think that's because they're not ambitious. I think it's just a question of it requires so many different things to fall into place that even if you work very, very diligently, we need to start now because there's a lot of work to be done. On the geographical scale, next slide please. It's also encouraging to see, and the Minister mentioned this, to see these initiatives happening all around the world. There is a strong first mover scene in kind of the North Sea area, the Baltic Sea, and I think of course there's a lot of short sea shipping, a lot of countries really looking into move this, but we also see other parts of the world. One thing to maybe point out is the global south is less well represented, and I think when we look forward and looking into how we can build an equitable transition, it is important to get those countries on board. And I think one of the really, really big opportunities, and I think we've heard a lot about this here at COP, is around the new energy commodities that are going to be traded. If we start producing green hydrogen, whether that's transported as ammonia or another molecule, most of this will be on ships. And if you're transporting that from, say, Namibia, South Africa, why don't you do that on zero-emission ships and think about how these two synergies can be reaped? So that's, I think, something to explore, and I think something that we are also looking actively into. Looking at the stakeholders, next slide. I think, and maybe again not surprising, it's really the kind of the core pieces of the value chain, the shipping operators, the ports that have taken the lead on the private sector side. I think this is encouraging, but I think one of the things that we see needs to happen is we need to bring in more of the energy companies. Most of the investments that are going to be needed to run zero-emission ships are in the fuel production, and we need to bring the energy companies, whether it's the traditional energy companies or the new energy companies that will deliver the green hydrogen fuels, we need to bring those along. And we also need the customers that are willing to say, we will demand and pay for green shipping. We see a lot of movement also in this space, but I think something that we need to get involved in even more, and a lot of kudos to the work of the COSEV Alliance looking to really mobilize that demand from shipping customers. Looking at the shipping segment, next slide please, we see initiatives across the space. Not surprisingly, maybe a lot of movement in the container space because containers operate across fixed lines and maybe are closer to customers and can see the business case easier. And it's really encouraging to see that there are 8 different container companies involved in green shipping corridors, representing more than 85% of global container capacity, which is massive. We're also seeing a lot of ferries, and I think, again, very, very encouraging. And we do see some work being done in the bulk sector, the tanker and the dry bulk sector. We think that there's more opportunity here. Tristan Smith from University College London published some data yesterday that's now publicly available that really shows some of that potential. So it's not just container shipping, there are a lot of things, and to get to zero by 2050, we need all segments to move, and we need to find solutions that work for each of those segments. Next slide, please. So the million-dollar question in shipping decarbonization at the moment is, what's the silver bullet? What's the fuels we're going to use in the future? Because if I know that, I can just go straight for that. And I think what we're seeing in the Green Corridor studies is the jury is still out. We see projects that are focusing on ammonia, methanol, advanced biofuels, direct electrification. But we also see a lot of projects where they haven't made the decision as to which fuel to look for. And I think one of our recommendations is you need to quite early figure out what's the fuel you're going to look into, because if you're going to bring in energy companies, of course they're going to say, are you going to be buying my product or my competitor's product? Otherwise you can't involve them. So creating that clarity around, at the corridor level, not necessarily at the industry level, but at the corridor level, what are the things that we're going to really look into and that we believe will suit our operational patterns and our energy infrastructure. And next slide, please. So we also spoke to the people running the corridors about what do they need from government to make this happen. And I think the clear message was, we need a lot. There's a lot governments can do. I think one of the things was requested was direct government participation to help convene the right stakeholders, to help make sure that the projects are aligned with overall government priorities, and also thought about in terms of the overall energy strategies. As I think we'll hear from the Port of Dover, having access to electricity is not something a port or a shipping company can do on its own. It's part of that whole energy transition that's happening. I think also government support in terms of helping fund those feasibility studies, pre-feasibility studies to understand is there actually potential, what is required, has been a catalyst in some of the projects. Also looking at regulatory approvals. We know that to build these things, to have the permits to operate new fuels will require government intervention, and fast tracking this and having clear frameworks for doing that is something that can really help speed up the process. And then the money. When you're doing innovation, when you're taking risk to introduce first mover technologies, there's a big risk, and companies and society knows, and this is something that's a driving force behind innovation policy in general, is a lot of the benefits for the first movers will not go to those companies. They might lose a lot of money because they chose the wrong fuel, the wrong technology, but society will learn. And this is why traditionally governments has been in and supported that innovation, helped de-risk it, because innovation creates opportunities for societies. So some of this is around the CapEx funding, the initial investments, but I think more and more we get the message it's really about closing that price gap between the more expensive green fuels, because by starting introducing these, we can bring down the cost and make it more cost competitive, and hopefully also while we build a regulatory framework that puts a price on pollution and also helps close that gap. So really looking into those investments and help de-risk the private sector. That's what we hear from a lot of the corridors. The flip side is we also ask governments, what are you doing to help green corridors? And I think the good story is they're actually doing a lot of the things that companies and the industry is asking for, whether that is help convene stakeholders, whether it's funding, giving targeted funding to the development of the initial projects. We see some really, really good initiatives, especially I think in Northern Europe, where money has been dedicated. I know Singapore is also supporting the work of their industry. Really also need to have a dialogue around the fuel pathways. Again, linking shipping decarbonization to the national energy policies to understand where are the synergies, how can we support this. And those are happening at least seven Clydebank countries understanding how this, and we see a lot of focus on the hydrogen supply chains. So whereas it might not be clear exactly what molecule, I think we're increasingly seeing the opportunity to link a transition to the hydrogen economy to those different hydrogen-derived fuels that can be produced to supply shipping. So very, very positive. I think one of the things we're going to see in the next couple of years in terms of moving from the conceptual, the pre-phase into action, is really about the money. Is there that willingness to help share the risk and move this forward? And I think that's one of the key things. And I think one of the things, and we're seeing this maybe in particular in the European Union, where shortly shipping will start paying into the European ETS. And if part of this funding that shipping is actually help raising is reinvested into the industry, this can really, really de-risk the first movers. We did some calculation. If only 20% of the revenues expected from shipping in the EU ETS was invested in contracts for difference to help cover the price cost, we could get to 5% zero-emission fuels in Europe by 2030. So a lot of opportunities here to find ways and help the industry make that transition. So what are the conclusions? And maybe next slide. So basically, to sum up, I think the leadership of the UK government, other governments, and first movers across the industry has put us in a position where progress in terms of the scope, the number of initiatives has really exceeded our expectations. 21 projects in just 1 year and more to come. I think that's really, really impressive. We can also see that amount of collaboration, sharing of information, working across both domestically, internationally. I think the Mission Innovation Shipping Mission is a good example of that. It's also really, really picking up. We see on the progress against the timeline that the next tipping point is, can we make enough progress? Can we make it concrete? Can we move into the actual implementation phase? I think that's a big thing. We really need those customers to come on board again and send those demand signals. So I think hopefully by next year when we do the next, this will have moved. Again, we also need to bring in more of the energy companies. One of my interesting takeaways from COP was there was a huge difference between being in sessions with energy companies or green hydrogen, talking about how much they're going to produce and saying, we don't know where the demand is coming from, but we can produce these millions and millions of tons of green hydrogen. And then in sessions with demand side sectors and saying, we can decarbonize steel, we can decarbonize aviation, we can decarbonize shipping, but we don't know where those fuels are going to come from. We don't know if that's there. So maybe next year when we come together in the Emirates, can we have those conversations together to unleash those synergies? I think that's one of the really, really key things. And again, I mentioned this, when you're working in a green corridor, find the fuel pathway so you can reach out to the right stakeholders. And again, collaboration is key. And I think with the political leadership we're seeing, with the leadership from industry, I think we're in a good place to make progress. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I hope next year we can come and present even better numbers. Thank you. And I have time for one or two questions, I'm told, so now's your chance.
Thank you so much for the presentation. We were also part of the Green Corridor event at the Danish Pavilion yesterday. My name is Therese Herman. I'm the Director for Global Public Affairs and Topso. We are essentially a company that produces the technologies that goes into green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, pink hydrogen, and all its derivatives to produce these essential fuels for the future. My question is very much related to the silver bullet that you mentioned. Is it a very good idea for the shipping industry to put all your eggs in the basket with e-methanol and biomethanol, since in aviation there will be a huge demand for that? In particular, the biogenic carbon that is needed to produce jet fuel. So in that respect, shouldn't you go for green ammonia instead, which is essential carbon-free, and it's a drop-in fuel that you can use as well? So I think that's something there that needs to be sorted out, because otherwise you will have to make production plants with biomass only to produce biogenic CO2. And there are alternative fuels for the shipping industry, but not for aviation. Thank you.
So thank you for the question. I think if you want to get the very, very detailed explanation, I think you should talk to Tristan Smith from University College London afterwards. I think one of the things that is, and we heard this a little bit yesterday, the first phase of the transition is probably going to be a little bit messy as different things are tried out. I think the advantage of methanol in the short run is we have the ship technologies to run on methanol. We already have ships. So it's the easy transition that can be made today. I think we can also see a lot of the companies investing in methanol ships are also actively seeking out their fuel supply. So the question you raised, and which I think is the really relevant question, is how scalable is this? How far can it get us? And we will see over the coming years, but we do see a lot of companies looking into ammonia as a long-term opportunity. The challenge still remains. The engines are not there yet. We know they will going to be there in a few years, but you can actually order a ship, which if you want to move now, you need to wait a little bit. And also there's still concerns about the safety. And I know we have Charles Haskell from Lloyd's Register who's leading a lot of work on ammonia safety. So again, progress is being made, but there's a few things that need to be made out. But I think just looking at the molecules and what you need to produce it, ammonia has a really, really strong case. I'm free. Thank you.
Casper, thank you very much for that presentation. That was excellent. What's really nice, I thought, from my takeaways from the presentation is twofold. One was often in COP there's a lot of talk, but actually what was great to see was the action we were getting from it. And I think the fact that there's so much progress has been made in the last 12 months is really inspiring. The second point I took from it, it's not all from the government perspective. It's great to see industry really leaning into this. And it's not a recalcitrant industry. It's not one that's hesitant, but one really addressing some of the real complex issues we've got. So I think that was a really inspiring presentation. So thank you very much. Could I ask our panelists to come and join me on the stools, please? Thank you. Thank you. I always think bar stools are just designed to make us all feel slightly uncomfortable, or sort of a drink, or it's karaoke, isn't it? Maybe we could do a little bit of boy zone at this point. Look, anyway, sorry, enough of my social life. Anyway, I'm Gareth Davis. I'm Permanent Secretary at the Department for Transport in the United Kingdom. I'm responsible for leading the UK's work on decarbonisation. So maritime is absolutely critical to the work we're doing. And I say, thank you, Casper, for showing just quite how much progress is being made on the green corridors. But I think now's our opportunity to really hear from the experts and hear a little bit more about the detail of what's been happening in the last 12 months, some of the challenges, and hopefully some optimistic notes to leave us with. But before I start, can I maybe ask the panel just to introduce themselves? Elisa.
Good morning, thank you. My name is Elisa Kranes. I lead ports and shipping program at C40 Cities. And we are the lead convener for the Los Angeles, Shanghai, and Los Angeles, Long Beach, Singapore corridors.
Thank you very much. Christian.
Morning, everyone. I'm Christian Price from the Port of Dover. I'm here representing the Dover, Dunkirk, Calais green shipping corridor and the consortium of partners with the University of Kent, University of Warwick, our ferry operators, and also Schneider as part of a consortium.
Thank you.
Baroness Veer, UK Transport Minister, responsible for aviation, maritime and security.
I'm Ong Hing, Senior Advisor in the Singapore Ministry of Transport, representing also the Maritime and Port Authority of Singapore. I cover sustainability and climate action across all transport domains in the ministry. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe I can start with Elisa. Do you talk us through a little bit more about why the Shanghai LA route was so important and what made it so attractive for being a green corridor?
Yeah, so maybe just a bit of background of how we got involved in Los Angeles, Shanghai, and green corridors to begin with. So C40 is an organization of cities collaborating on climate action. And about 2 years ago, we launched a ports network, a global network of port cities that work together on climate issues. And one of the big topics that the network wanted to work on were green corridors. So this was about 2 years ago. We came up with some ideas. And then moving forward to Clydebank, when Clydebank Declaration got launched during last COP, it really helped us turn those ideas into action. And several months later, so January 2022 is when we announced the Los Angeles Shanghai Green Shipping Corridor, which we're very excited about because it's one of the busiest and one of the most carbon-intensive container routes in the world, responsible for moving over 40% of all goods arriving into the United States. The partners on this corridor are committed to cut emissions on this route and have set near-term goals for 2025 and 2030 to get low and zero carbon fueled ships in operation on this route. But this corridor is not just about reducing emissions. It aims to catalyze the transition to clean fuels and help the shipping industry reach the tipping point of 5% zero-emission fuels by 2030. It also aims to demonstrate and develop a scalable and replicable model for how to run a corridor partnership. And by run a corridor partnership, I don't just mean to set it up and launch a green shipping corridor. I mean administrating the partnership, running it through the implementation, and really establishing a process and a governance structure that works as you're bringing together partners from public and private sector and have a large number of stakeholders involved. So in terms of what the partnership has accomplished in the last 12 months, we have been working on the implementation plan for the corridor, which will be published before the end of this year. We're very excited about it. The next step for the corridor will be implementing the corridor and getting into some of the specific activities related to fuels, planning for infrastructure, planning for policy support, and really getting the corridor off the ground. And then one more thing I would add is the Los Angeles-Shanghai corridor led us to launch a new green shipping corridor, which was announced during the Green Shipping Challenge last week, which is with Los Angeles, Long Beach, and Singapore. We are very excited about this new corridor effort. It is going to follow a different model. It will be supply-driven versus demand-driven, which is what the Los Angeles-Shanghai corridor is, and we're really looking forward to getting the work started with Singapore on that. So that's my.
Thank you. I think it's so exciting to hear the progress you've made just in the last 12 months. And I think if we can crack it for LA, Shanghai, because of the density and the frequency of shipping across that route, we'll help create a template for the rest of the world. So thank you, that's really exciting. Christian, how's it going in Dover, Calais, Dunkirk? UK government spent a lot of time thinking about this route because it's absolutely critical for the UK freight sector and our imports of critical goods, food, medicines and the like. How are you looking at it?
So just for people who aren't familiar with the Port of Dover, we are in the very southeastern corner of the United Kingdom. We're only 22 miles from the UK to France. So therefore, if we start thinking about decarbonisation and the potential electrification of vessels, it will be through Dover and the short straits. Just in terms of context, as Gareth was saying, £144 billion worth of trade per year comes through the Port of Dover. That's 33% of everything that's transported between the United Kingdom and the European Union. 120 to 130 ferry movements per day and up to 10,000 trucks per day come through the port onto the UK's strategic road network. Therefore, when we talk about the creation of a green corridor, what we're really excited about, and especially with the support of Department for Transport and the Clean Maritime Demonstration Competition, is we're not just looking at the maritime element, we're also looking at all of the land-based emissions of those 10,000 trucks per day that are entering and exiting the UK strategic road networks. So we started this journey last year through the CMDC Round 1 and starting to understand what the energy requirements might be, and last year ambitiously we looked at the 2 hybrid vessels that one of our operators is introducing on the route, and the numbers started to scare us a little bit when we started looking at up to 35 megawatts of power just for some hybrid vessels. But our operators and ourselves as ports are much more ambitious than just the hybrid vessels that we're looking at right now. So when we started digging into this a little bit more in the 13 vessels on our routes, we started looking at 150 megawatts of power within the port. And again, that's just for the maritime element. We've only got 8 megawatts of power within the Port of Dover right now. So how do we bring the power to the port? It's not just about the ship-to-shore connectors and the connectivity and the vessels. We also need to make sure that the ports have got all the power. So again, our clear message is, as a port, we're going to be net zero by 2025 as a port, which is a fantastic achievement. It's 25 years ahead of what the mandate is, and we're very, very proud of that. But that's only 0.4% of the problem. This is why we're here announcing what we're trying to do in terms of green corridors, and it's not just the maritime element, it's also the transport. So CMDC2 that we'll be working with DFT starts in January with our consortium of partners, and we're very, very excited on that because, again, it's the trucks, it's the ships, and we're the second busiest cruise port in the UK as well. So we're trying to keep the scope as broad as possible while still making tangible progress year on year.
Thank you, Christian. I mean, what's really interesting about the Port of Dover, it's a frequency of the journeys and the way in which essentially it's roll on, roll off, and trucks turn up and can use it almost a bit like a bridge from the UK perspective to the continent. Can I ask a bit about how you talked about very compellingly about the challenges on electrification of the port, the work with the energy companies. Can you maybe just get a little perspective on how your conversations are going with the shipping companies, another key partner in this?
Sure. Just again to do some of that context, Gareth, because of our frequency as highlighted, it's a 45-minute turnaround period. So when the vessel enters and 150 units of freight exit our ferry and then enter again, we have 45 minutes to put 20 megawatts of power if electrification is the route chosen. 45 minutes to recharge and refuel the vessel. So that's quite significant. So we've got 2 hybrid vessels arriving next year from P&O, and one of our other operators is looking at full electrification or greenification of their fleet by 2030. And this is why we're trying to do all of these different exercises now in terms of feasibility, because we need to be acting now if we're going to get the port ready in terms of the infrastructure. And again, it's not just Dover. We have signed an MOU also with Dunkirk and Calais on the other side, and the operators key to that are also involved. So we're all working together on that.
Well, a great partnership on that, and a big shout out for your work to get towards net zero at the port by 2025. I think that's incredible. That's an incredible goal, a real stretch goal. I think really impressive how you're working towards that, so thank you. Can I focus now on the role of government? And Casper, you talked a lot about how, yes, it's industry that's driving decarbonisation in maritime, but there's a role for governments as well to play here. Mr. Yap, could you set out what you're doing in the Singapore government to help decarbonisation of maritime?
Well, first, I would like to congratulate the UK for launching the Clydebank Declaration and for the strong progress that has been made 1 year on. Let me first talk about the Singapore government's role in advancing green and digital shipping corridors. This is one area which we see as both catalyzing and accelerating the decarbonization of shipping. One clear example is that Singapore, the Maritime Port of Authority, MPA, has signed an MOU with the Port of Rotterdam Authority in August this year. And this is to establish the world's longest green and digital shipping corridor to enable low to zero carbon shipping port to port. The MOU brings all the stakeholders across the value chain to realize the first sustainable vessel sailing on this route by 2027. And of course, it will be very much on the use of green marine fuels, but also digitalization to facilitate the seamless movement of vessels port to port. And of course, more recently, at the US-Norway initiated Green Shipping Challenge, we also announced our cooperation with the Port of Los Angeles, Port of Long Beach, and C40 cities to begin discussions on green and digital shipping corridors with the San Pedro Bay port complex. And I think as mentioned by the Minister earlier, under the Singapore Australia Green Economy Agreement, we are also starting discussions with Australia to establish green and digital shipping corridors under the Clydebank partnership. Now, we of course see green and digital shipping corridors complementing and reinforcing the work of the International Maritime Organization, or IMO, in decarbonizing and digitalizing international shipping. Other areas that we are doing with respect to maritime decarbonization, first, we are taking a concerted, holistic strategy to decarbonize the maritime sector, both domestically and internationally. And this is very much contained in the Singapore Maritime Decarbonization Blueprint working towards 2050 that was launched in March this year. Now it has 7 focus areas from port terminals to future green marine fuels to green financing, and we are of course taking actions on all these areas. One area in particular I would like to highlight is that Singapore is committed to provide low to zero carbon fuel solutions to meet the future energy needs of the shipping sector. And here we are undertaking various efforts with government funding, research and development, demonstration, innovation, as using Singapore as an ecosystem test bed to promote and develop these solutions for the shipping sector's multi-fuel transition. I just want to highlight the example of ammonia. We are participating in 4 green shipping consortiums to establish ammonia supply chains in Singapore and on the development of ammonia-fueled vessels. And the Global Center for Maritime Decarbonization in Singapore, that is again supported through co-funding by government and industry, have embarked on a project to define the safety and operational envelopes to enable ammonia bunkering pilot and demonstration. This project will provide inputs to facilitate regulatory sandbox for ammonia bunkering trials. And of course, overall, Singapore is very keen to promote collaboration. We are very active in advancing that and in participating in various collaborative efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Really interesting about the regulatory sandbox. I'll be particularly keen for us to work together on ammonia, because I think there's big opportunities on ammonia, but as we heard, lots of concerns around safety as well, and exactly how we manage the environment around some of these new fuels is going to be incredibly important for public confidence in the system. Could I come to Baroness Veer now, please? You've heard from a number of the panelists, from Caspar, about the role of government. Could you maybe touch on how you see government playing a role in helping to de-risk some of these big investments that we know that they're going to have to make?
Yes, certainly, and what a fascinating panel so far. And the one thing that I'm sort of taking away is we all have an awful lot to learn from each other. And we've got to figure out how we're going to share all this knowledge, because a lot of people are doing some very, very exciting things. And as we continue in quite uncertain times, because we don't know which fuels are going to be used for what, we don't know when the vessels are going to be fully available, we don't know how quickly we can get in the storage and supply of the various fuels, we do need to learn from each other, because, you know, you just have to hear about the sort of electricity requirements that the Port of Dover would need, and I'm just sitting here thinking, oh, wow. And someone told me that one cruise ship, if you plug in a cruise liner, it's the same amount of electricity as Stansted Airport times 5. I mean, that's a shocker. So, you know, in terms of, and putting in new electricity, I think, as we all know, doesn't happen in a day. It takes ages to get better electricity supply. So there is an awful lot of learning to do. It's an incredibly exciting time. But anyway, enough about that. What can government do? And I think that, you know, from my perspective, government has many, many roles to fill in all of this, and two of the key ones are in terms of sort of providing funding and that sort of support is around innovation, and then second around market failure. And so, you know, we've got £206 million in UK Shore, which is our office that looks after emissions, and out of that we're starting to get that out there, you know, through the Clean Maritime Demonstration Competition. I know we were able to help Port of Dover in that. We're doing 3 feasibility studies in the second round of the CMDC, which is absolutely critical. We've got to get these feasibility studies up and running. I'm a bit concerned that we might not be ahead of the game in that one, so we've got to hurry up. But I think our next job is actually figure out where we're going to go next with the next round of funding. Obviously, from an international perspective, it's very key, and I will come back to this again and again and again with my colleagues over the next few months, is how are we going to get a proper target over the line? Why do we need a proper target? It is to provide certainty and clarity. If we have that certainty and clarity, then the next job of government comes into play, and that is to provide the regulations. Because we all know that maritime is full, absolutely bursting with regulations, and we're going to need a whole new load of them, which will have to be based on international standards. We do not want proliferation of national standards around the world. We need to try and have consistent international standards then government will need to put those into place. Obviously, we'll be working domestically with our ports and the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, but also, you know, thinking about the vessels when they come in and the sorts of requirements we need to have on them. So I look at it as a huge mountain of work, but it's a mountain that we must all climb in order to de-risk the sorts of investments that we're asking the private sector to make now. We are asking the private sector to make some pretty big calls. We need them to make it. Government can't do it on its own. But I absolutely stand by the private sector to work with them as we take things forward.
Thank you. I love your focus on collaboration, because it's a shared challenge, isn't it? But at the same time, I like your little bit of a competitive instinct coming out there. Maybe we can harness, should we say, the positive competition and collaborative instincts here amongst the panel. Right, final question for the panel. I think, you know, look, we've all been inspired by the sense of progress in the last 12 months, as really clearly set out by Caspar. Free yourself forward 12 months. We're all a few miles away in the UAE, COP28. What's a big thing you'd like to be able to hear about in terms of progress over the next 12 months? Elisa, can I start with you?
So I think there are a couple of things that we think need to happen. First is carriers, shipping lines, have some big tasks. They have to organize their technology, their clean ships, and deploy them on green corridors. Yeah. They have to develop feasibility for fuels. And they need to do it in a unified way, so that when we are developing the pathway to zero, we're all speaking the same language and using the same standards. And this is what we've been trying to do on the Los Angeles-Shanghai corridor in the carrier working group, is exactly that. I think that having a unified voice from the carriers would be extremely helpful. This is something we see cargo owners have come up with. So our partners and friends from Aspen COSAV have created a coalition of cargo owners who are a partner on the LA Shanghai project and have been involved in many other shipping decarbonization initiatives. So I think that having a unified effort from the carriers would be super helpful. Cargo owners, they have the market power to encourage carriers, and I think some really good efforts are already underway through Aspen COSAV. Ports need to advocate for green corridor policy. So again, having a unified voice from ports would be helpful. I think back to Casper's point about cross-value chain collaboration and cross-collaboration, I think it's really important that the corridors, we have 21 of them, that's a lot of corridors in a year. The corridor efforts need to start talking to each other. We need to start thinking about corridors as a green shipping network versus individual green shipping corridors, and start communicating with each other in that fashion. And then I think the final point I'd like to make is I think we need a culture change, in a sense that when we think about goods movement, we need to stop thinking about how do I move this container box from point A to point B in the cheapest possible way. The thinking should be, how do I move this container box with the least possible emissions? And I think that's something that is a culture change, and unless that shift happens, we're going to be in a long uphill battle to decarbonize global goods movement.
I think that's a great point. That sense of can be quite a fragmented industry. I know there's consolidation amongst the owners, but I think that fragmentation is a real barrier to where we're working. And that sense of looking at the end-to-end process and being forensic about where the carbon is at each step of the process is totally right. But I love the ambition for the next 12 months. Christian, what's your perspective? What would you want to see in UAE?
I think we're in danger of all saying relatively similar things, which is a good thing, right? So 3 points from me. One is even more collaboration. Second is coalescing, and the third is around focus and prioritization. So on the collaboration point, I think there's lots of public-private sector involvement here, whether it's through governments and university and the ports and operators. I think we can encourage more internationally as well, so it's great to hear from Casper. And in terms of the timelines, I think what's really, really concerning is if we were all doing these in our own separate silos or own consortiums. So welcome the news yesterday in terms of the creation of the hub, so we can all start sharing our learnings and not wasting any time, because we haven't got enough of it. Coalescing. I think, again, because of the time element here, what we can't have is a VHS and a Betamax situation. So that's difficult enough for myself in terms of the 3 ports and the 3 operators, but we really need to start working together in terms of a single joined-up solution, whether it be the connectors, whether it be on the fuels, and what is on vessel technology. So I'd like coalescing around solutions, obviously that from the port's perspective. That would be very, very helpful. And focus and prioritization. When belts are tightening around the world in terms of budgets, we need to start focusing on where we can get our greatest bang for buck, I think. We're a very proud maritime nation in the UK, and we want to be able to enhance and share our learnings as much as is possible.
Thank you. And if I was going to push you here on timings, it'd be a bit challenging. You set a good ambitious target around 2025 for decarbonising the port. I won't hold you to it, I promise. But when do you think the first electric ferry we can see on the Calais-Dover route might be?
2030.
2030. That's good. That's good. Baroness Veer, what would you want to see in UAE?
Well, I'm going to say something different for a change. Let's see if this works, okay? Obviously, my first point is going to be reaching agreement at the IMO, because by then we will have had the next session of the IMO, and that's going to be really important. The other thing I want to see in COP28, look, I know we're focused on carbon emissions, but we must also think about the co-benefits. It is not always only about carbon. The other benefits of improved air quality, reducing other types of waste, and improving noise pollution, I think are key too, and we must also, so it may be that a certain pathway will offer, you know, maximum carbon benefits, but no air quality benefits. So we've got to think, I do think, in sort of the wider emissions and pollution world. I know we're talking about carbon, but sometimes it's good to look a little bit beyond that.
I think the trick is, as you say, how can we do both and, not either or here? So how can we hit all these goals with the same policies? Mr. Yap.
3 points from me. One, we must have concrete actions, collective concrete actions on maritime decarbonization, and in particular green and digital shipping corridors. We must also have greater visibility of these actions. Yesterday, the Green Shipping Corridors Hub portal was launched, which will provide a lot of information on green and digital shipping corridor projects, and this will potentially allow for leveraging of synergies between corridor projects, as well as connecting more partners across the value chain to the various projects. One thing I should highlight is that actions and visibility are important also to raise investment confidence and attract green financing for the various solutions that are being developed. Two, it is essential that we bring green shipping corridors into the IMO as a complementary and reinforcing effort. Singapore is leading efforts in the IMO. We are putting up a proposal paper to incorporate green shipping corridors into the resolutions of the Maritime or the Marine Environment Protection Committee on voluntary cooperation between the port and shipping sectors, as well as voluntary national action plans. This paper is co-sponsored by many member states and will be discussed at MEPC 79 this December. Third, it is imperative that member states adopt the IMO strategy for international shipping GHG emissions reduction with higher ambition that is aligned with keeping a 1.5 degree increase within reach as agreed in the Glasgow Climate Pact, and at the same time ensuring inclusivity for developing countries to contribute to maritime decarbonization with relevant support. This, as mentioned by the Minister, will send a strong signal for countries, the industry and partners to advance on a clear decarbonization path for international shipping, including through green shipping corridors. I was privileged to witness the adoption of the Paris Agreement at COP21, and then a Paris moment at the 41st International Civil Aviation Organization Assembly, and I look forward to witnessing a Paris moment at IMO. Thank you.
I love it. I think that sense of ambition around how the IMO can help us collaborate, create some of the shared language that we've been talking about, and help really accelerate this transition. I think that's a great note to end on. Can I just take the opportunity to thank our panel, please? Thank you very much. And Baroness Veer, would you like to close the session today? Thank you.
Well, I hope you all found that as interesting as I did. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much to the panel, to Alyssa, to Christian, to Mr. Yapsipur, to Gareth, and of course to Caspar for his excellent presentation. And I think he gave us quite a good school report there. I think he said we're doing well, but obviously we have many years ahead of us. And I hope that next time we speak, you will also be able to say that we've had a positive year. So I will certainly take away all of the actions that is within the remit of the UK government. We will continue our leadership internationally on this matter, working very closely with our colleagues in the UK in terms of getting funding out of the door to help some of these projects progress as quickly as possible to really put rocket boosters behind the sorts of innovation that we need. I am, listening to what's been going on today, I think there's a lot of work to be done around energy and fuel, and where is it going to come from, who's going to provide it, and I also think that that is not something that is just a domestic concern. It is also an international concern, and we're going to have to look at where our future fuel supplies are going to come from. Anyway, a huge amount of exciting stuff to happen. I'm really delighted to see so many of you here today and look forward to working with you. So thank you.